Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini, our co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning. Great to be with you, Dr. Paul.
Good. We have an easy subject today. There's a debt going on, and a couple people, at least from our group of people, thinking, and maybe there's 5 or 6 in the Congress, are beginning to see that this might be a problem. So people are fretting a little bit, and some people are in denial. But it's no sweat. They can take care of it. But in the meantime, we don't. The economy, if it gets a little painful reaction to what they're doing, they have pain pills that they take. I bet you didn't even know that. But the congressmen take pain pills, and I'm obviously saying that figuratively. They have to take care of the pain that the people complain about, and therefore you can do that for a long time, and that's what's happening. And they get endorsed, and that is spend more money, take care of people, you get reelected, and you just expand government. If there's a correction and people get really worried, just speed up the printing presses. But Chris, what I see here now is it used to be just the printing presses. You only had to print out the money and pass out the money, and everybody was happy. But it's a little more sophisticated that now, because it has to be much faster. That was way too slow. So computers have been helpful. We still use that term, printing press money, artificial money printed out of thin air. But it's really just credit that is created by the Fed, and they distribute it rather quickly. They think they have wonderful control about it to make sure that the right people get it, and there's no deceit about it, and it doesn't do any bad things. But as we look at this, we find out that it does a lot of harm. It might temporarily relieve a pain in this area or a difficulty here, and it might even stimulate somebody else, and they're happy about it. But long term, I think, is here, because the many years that I have watched this, I would see the economy going in cycles, and they would be back off and raise interest rates a little bit, and that would cause a bit of a recession, and that would correct things, and debt would be reduced, and they thought, boy, we have this knock, we'll just manage it. Until just recently, I would say, a couple years ago, with the Great Recession, it didn't work that way. I mean, then we had to have some of these grand schemes to really inflate. And in the meantime, it became more acceptable than a lot of people believed. And to the point where the balance sheet meant nothing, except that's the place you park this extra credit. And the spending, there are no limitations, and that fit the philosophy that's been taught in our universities, whether they're progressives or socialists or whatever, or Keynesian Republicans who like that too. It sort of satisfied them, and they were able to do it. And just a few, and one person we wanted to quote today, Chris, is the article that Peter Schiff wrote, because he understands Austrian economics. He gave me support in the campaign, and he knows what's wrong. But sometimes Austrian economists, including sometimes what I say, sometimes we're ahead of things. So when I make a prediction or think something, I don't know exactly when things are going to happen. But Austrian economics tells us that we know certain things will happen. We know if there's an unlimited supply of money, no matter how noble the cause is, well, we're going to take care of people who are sick, people who are poor. We're going to protect the world. We have to protect our empire. And it's just a wonderful thing that we will do. But no matter how flowering the speech is, the printing of the money and the deficit run up is very, very dangerous, and I think we are. Peter had, I think in one of the articles we saw, I don't know whether this was in his newsletter or what, but it showed the sinking ship. And the weight of the debt is just sinking the ship. And of course, the question is raised, and we subtly refer to that in our title, is who does get blamed for this? And you might ask, well, maybe now that the Republicans are out of office, the Democrats will get blamed for it. But others, because of the popularity now of everybody has to hate Trump with a vengeance, and anybody who's ever talked to him, the Republicans are at fault. But who knows, Chris? There may be a few other people guilty of running up this debt and creating this monster bubble that we will see one day, probably not in the too distant future.
Right, Dr. Paul. And Peter brought to our attention a quote from Janet Yellen, who wants to be a part of the Biden administration. And she said, I'll paraphrase, that, yeah, they understand the country's debt burden, but right now interest rates are at historic lows. So the smartest thing to do is to act big, which, she says that is okay because interest rates are at historic lows. Well, interest rates are artificially at historic lows. These are not real rates. And unfortunately, President Trump said the same thing. It was okay to go into debt because the Fed was keeping rates low. But because it's artificial, people are doing things that they would not do if they were dealing with reality. So look just at these last several decades. People went into debt. They started all these crazy .com companies, and 90% of them went bust. Then we had the housing, and million shopping centers are being built everywhere, houses and lotteries to flip houses that you don't even see. This is what people do when the Fed artificially keeps rates low. So they create these fake booms, but the busts are very, very real, and we feel them. So the whole process from start to finish is a lie, and they just want to keep this lie going.
Chris, you're right in emphasizing this issue of interest rates, and I talk about it a lot because it's the most important price that exists, in the modern day economic climate. It's always important, but you already mentioned that the Fed has a role to play on getting these rates censored, and they're artificial. So they're sending the wrong signal. So if the rate of interest is important, the artificialness is going to cause artificial expansion in different areas. So it's safe to say, especially under these extreme conditions of this tremendous amount of increase in monetary units, and that's M1 and the balance sheet and all of this, is a tremendous amount of malinvestment and debt. It's easy for people to measure. The debt is huge. It's $28 trillion now for our national debt, but it probably still has room to keep going up because people falsely have confidence in this system. The university professors who teach economics, they're satisfied. That's what they've been teaching. Wow, we've been successful. What about this crazy stuff of limiting the amount of credit and limiting your money supply with maybe something like gold? That's so old-fashioned. They don't want. They're so glad to bury those ideas. But the interest rate is very, very important. But it has to be a market rate that gives the signal to the businessman, to the consumer, to the savers, and yet it's so artificial. So this is the reason that bubbles form. This is the reason I believe, and anybody who understands, Austrian economics knows that there's a bubble here and bubble there and bubbles everywhere. And it was always safe, in the 90s and in the early part of this century, that when those bubbles were spotted, many of us would talk about that, and they eventually burst. This bubble is going on because there's been no resistance and really inflating like never before, and this keeps people, and most people have been talked into thinking, well, this is a new era, and that term has been around for a long time, 100 years. A new era, it's different this time, and it certainly is different this time. They have convinced enough people not to sweat the deficit, and you keep spending, and if you're in politics, no matter whether you're a conservative or liberal, just think we had a Republican administration for 4 years, and things didn't improve when it came to the deficit. The welfareism continued, the warfareism, the spending in the military machine, that continued. The bubble kept getting bigger and bigger, and yet, for a certain class of people, mostly those in the wealthy class, have done quite well. But there's still a lot of people, there's more street people living in the street right now than ever before. So it's characteristically, a system like this always distorts the distribution of the wealth that is earned, and that means there's a motive then to inflate more and more. So the big question is who's going to get blamed? When is it going to come? And will we be able to turn this around gracefully, or will it's going to end with some very, very serious problems?
Yes, it's going to be the latter, unfortunately. But I'd like to draw a analogy, Dr. Paul, for our listeners and viewers so they can see how crazy this whole central banking system is. And I'll use a simple example. Let's say you're at the supermarket, and normally the market price of a loaf of bread, let's say, is $4. And a worker comes and puts a sign in front of the bread, and it's artificially lowered to 50 cents a loaf. So what happens? Well, people rush and they buy multiple loaves. It's on, this huge artificially low price. And eventually, by the time you even get there, the shelf is empty. And because the supermarket cannot create loaves of bread out of thin air, the shelf stays empty. Now let's go to the debts and rates. Let's say the market rates are 5%, 10%, the real market rate. And the Fed comes in and puts a sign that says it's 1%. Well, the same thing happens. People rush, they take out loans, they load up on debt, they're up to their necks in debt. But the difference is, whereas the supermarket can't create loaves of bread out of thin air, the Fed can create dollars out of thin air. They can never run out. And that's what they do. They create trillions and trillions of dollars. And this is the process that distorts the economy. It's insane, and it destroys the value of the dollar. And it ultimately reaches the point, and we may be reaching that point, where everyone is so dependent on this fake printed money for stimulus and loans and bailouts that they can't stop. So this system is failing, and eventually it will someday have to be shut down.
It will be, and I have a theory about how it's going to be shut down, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute or two, but my theory is that nobody comes along and turns the switch. The politicians won't do it. The Fed is not going to do it. They are locked in on continuing this policy, but it will be shut down. It's going to self-destruct because this is not. It's not possible to continue this process. But I want to mention a few things that gave us the setting for this tremendous bubble that we're in, and we're wondering how we're going to get out of it and what will happen with the new administration. And the one thing I can say for sure is that you're not going to elect several new or a bunch of new members of Congress and all of a sudden they're going to change their attitudes. In Washington, when I was there, I met very few who understood real free market economics, and they all started with the Keynesian model of the government has a lot of responsibility. They believed in inflationism. They believed in the Federal Reserve. They believed in the American empire. They believed that a certain amount of welfare was, that's the only thing you could do if you were a humanitarian. So that's all built in place, and that's not going to change. That's why I say the spending is going to continue until it doesn't function anymore, and that will come about when people get leery about using the dollar. And we're seeing now signs of it. Prices are going up. Gasoline prices are going up a little bit. Steel prices are going up. There's a lot of inflation. But if you measured the inflation, the price inflation, a consequence of the monetary inflation, you would look at the stock market. That's unbelievable. And then you'd look at the bond market of zero rate interest. So there's tremendous inflation, but endlessly you hear it on all the TV stations, the business station. Oh, well, we're trying to get the inflation rate up to 2%, and that will take care of everything. No, that's not going to work. But what we're doing, we've entered this thing a year or two ago now into a situation that is different. I mean, the normal correction was coming probably in 2018, and it was noticed that interest rates were creeping up, the markets were getting shaken, the bubble was too much, and the Fed was getting nervous, and they were thinking about talking back, and then the stock market started down because interest rates were rising. Well, then came along, there was an additional factor that came in. I think the bubble was well known at that time, and certainly by the end of 2019, it was. But 2020 is when the coronavirus hit, and it's very serious. One, it can make people very, very sick, and some people can die. But compared to other medical problems, it probably was not as dangerous as it was said to be. But the panic was huge. The reaction to it was huge, and this on top of the natural sequence of having a recession. When the coronavirus hit, yes, it scared a lot of people, but the reaction to it, the lockdown, they're just starting to wake up and realize kids don't get sick, and the schools have been ruining these kids, and masks don't work. All these things are now being discovered, and even the new administration said, they're hinting, well, maybe we don't need to do all this, So, but it has caused a lot of damage there. So the reaction to the viral infection has been very, very serious, and that, of course, what it means. The deficits exploded. QE, a little QE here and there is not enough like they used to get out of the last recession, the Great Recession of 2010. So now it's huge, and the money is rolling out. And neither Republican nor Democrat, except for the few, are really complaining. So in a way, on the short term, in the last 4 years, that has tided things over. Yeah, but the downturn, eventually was due to the fact that it doesn't work. There was too much debt, but now we have an additional factor going on which confuses people, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Is this obsession with Trump hatred? I mean, that's never been around before, and now that's half of the population, the people who supported him, and now they're off on this tangent. They do crazy things on monetary policy, but now they're working very hard. Seriously, this is a serious matter, and we have to follow the Constitution. So therefore, we have to impeach the president, even if he's not the president, and that has to raise some questions about the fuzziness of all this and how is this going to work out. But they have the printing presses so far, just print money, and that's going to take care of everybody. But I think the economy is much, much weaker. I think even if you had the coronavirus thing settled and you removed all the lockdown and all the penalties there and you just got rid of it, you're still going to have the major problem of the correction from the collapsing bubble that has been around for several years now. But the bubble is, in spite of the market trying to shrink that bubble, the politicians, and along with the cooperation of the Federal Reserve, have been able to expand this bubble. And that's why we have this crisis. We have this crisis in debt. We will have to face up to it. And if we don't do it with common sense, we will do it with uncommon sense, and it'll take care of itself. But that will be the thing that I always wanted to try to prevent. And that is just seeing the collapse of the system, either with runaway inflation or whatever it takes, because you don't know exactly how it will pan out. But you cannot have perpetual wealth by perpetual printing of money, creating new credit, and people will not accept that because it's much easier to take just more of your narcotic to make us all feel better.
Right, Dr. Paul. I'll finish up by echoing you largely by saying this is not a Republican or Democrat thing, or Trump or Biden. Trump, unfortunately, was terrible when it came to debt, Fed money printing, government spending. It's my belief that most of the people in Washington don't care, as long as they're not the ones that are going to end up holding the bag. They're not going to be the ones, they're betting at least, that are going to have to tell the multitudes of Americans that are dependent on government, oh, by the way, all that stuff we promised you, well, the game's over. They're not going to be the ones that are going to have to tell the millions and millions of people who work for government and think that their paycheck is guaranteed because they work for the government. They too will get a surprise that, sorry, the game is now over. So the politicians, they bet it'll be the next guy's problem, when it comes. And it's a shame. And this is what has happened through history. And that's why, and we reiterated on the show, gold and silver have been money for thousands and thousands of years. This is not the first time that this has happened. Governments, they do these crazy things and then they rush back to the money that can't be created out of thin air that nobody has a monopoly over. So good ideas ultimately will replace bad ideas, and hopefully we continue to grow the audience that understands the good ideas.
Very good. And no matter how strong the evidence is that big government spending and deficits and regulations and interference, even crony capitalism and fascism and socialism, we have so much evidence. The 20th century was full of evidence of the total failure of this, and I thought with the disappearance of the Soviet Empire, things would be improved. But no, they've accepted this softer form of interventionism, and they've been using it and spending like crazy and thinking they can get away with that. But the tax system doesn't work. We look at the failure in Venezuela and Zimbabwe and other countries, and we've even had our own history of how much harm it has done. But I think just this week was an example of so much confusion, and they do it with a straight face. That's what I'm astounded about, and that has to do with New York. New York has a problem up there. It's called a political problem of people who aren't that interested in even talking about or understanding what true liberty is all about and what a libertarian society would be like, what it would be like to have sound money, what it would be like to have limited spending. No, the opposite is true. And spend, and if you don't have enough money in your own state, then you have to go get it from the other states through the federal system. And that goes on. But New York now is one of those states where people have decided to leave. This is crazy, they say. The deficit gets worse, and the regulations get worse, and even the regulations of their efforts to contain the coronavirus, that was worse there than, say, South Dakota, where they had less problems and no real serious conflict with the economy. But New York, they had high taxes, high regulations. The virus made things much worse. And what really got them upset is people were leaving New York and coming to Texas. And why was that? Well, people say they have lower taxes there. There's less regulation. We're far from perfect. Let me tell you, I'd even improve some more things. But compared to New York, Texas does pretty well. So too many people came to Texas. That's a real insult. A liberal can't stand that people would pick Texas over New York. So what did they do after they realized that revenues went down tremendously because it was the rich people leaving? And that's happening in California too. So the rich leave, they pay less taxes. So there's some people left. There's a few people left that still have a lot of money. So what is the solution? To talk about their policies and maybe spend less money and live within our means and do all these things and become less socialistic? No, what they said, well, there's a couple people left. They still have some money. Let's raise taxes. Let's raise taxes on those people who survived what was going on. So their plan now is to raise taxes. I'm going to make a very bold prediction. It isn't going to work. It isn't going to work. And I'm going to work real hard every place to try to improve the situation so people don't have to move around. But in Texas, I would like to see Texas at least not drift into that side of the economic equation. And because that can happen. It's happened in other areas where one state is very liberal, and the one place I can think of right now is Massachusetts. They leave and go to neighboring states, and they take their ideas with them. Then the neighboring states they moved to got worse. So, if we get all those people who love the big spending from California and New York, they might come to Texas and say, oh, these people in Texas, they still believe in free markets and sound money and limited spending and all these kind of things. We have to teach them a lesson. But to expect a different result by, after chasing away the dwindling number of people who have some money, well, the answer is to raise taxes regulate them more, and we'll all be happy. And like I said, my bold prediction, it's not going to work. But my prediction also is that nationally speaking, even with the states that are much better off, nationally, it's not going to work, because nationally, the states that are using too much, they can't. They come to the federal government. The spending is going to continue. The deficits are going to continue. They're not going to give up the world empire that we operate from, and they're going to continue the spending. The welfare state is going to be there. The military-industrial complex will really be running the government. That's why it isn't a Republican or a Democrat issue. That's why it's really not a Washington political position of how the economy is run. It is truly those invisible people that are behind the big effort, say, at the Federal Reserve System, and pull the strings. So that is still alive and well, and they are very much in charge of continuing this process, along with the support they get from the intellectuals. They want support from the intellectuals. The ideology has to be an endorsement of this insanity, and that is what they get out of the universities, and that hasn't changed. People will have to look around. The conclusion of this is, once it's realized, people know what's going on, it has to involve something other than the government-run schools. The answer is not there. There can be isolated improvements, and there are some good people there, but basically government schools are used as a tool of propaganda to promote big government, big spending, and make people feel better about deficits, and never have any remorse. They never feel shame. If they set up a war and they lie us into a war, thousands of people are killed, and millions of people on the other side are killed, and it's discovered it was all based on a lie, and that's been around for a long time. Not just the Middle East wars, but Ukraine and different places, the small war, all based on misinformation. And yet, when it's discovered, disregarding how do you punish people, that never happens. What happens is the people must wake up and say, I thought this, and look, it backfired on us. It was much worse, and a lot of people died of my action, and they feel a little bit of remorse or shame. Zero. I've only had one or two people vote wrong, which the consequence was a big mistake. And the one perfect example I can use there was Walter Jones, who unfortunately is not with us anymore. He voted wrong on going to war in Afghanistan and in the Middle East. He became strongly anti-war, but he had remorse, and he and I talked about it a lot. I always thought he put way too much guilt on himself, because his position was, I was lied to. Can you believe that? FBI and the CIA and our State Department, everybody lied to him about what was going on over there, and finally the truth came out, and most people accept that now. That we were lied into the Middle East war. We were lied into Vietnam. So it's that thing that eventually is the most important, is the moral fiber of the people who get involved in promoting policies and what goes on with government, because that will have us an answer. That's where we really have to exert our efforts. Yes, it's important to know about the Constitution and good economic policy, but eventually it has to be the individuals who represent us and promote the ideas. The ideology has to be there, because ideology is what really ultimately controls everything. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.